For about 2 years, the most important man in world cricket was a Texan, who had never played the game, who grew up in a country that does not watch it, and who did not actually have any money. He had the appearance of money. In June of 2008 he arrived at Lord's, the 200-year-old ground in North London where the sport keeps its soul, by helicopter. Nothing lands on that grass. No cars, no commerce. His helicopter came down on the nursery ground with the blades still turning, and out he stepped, 6'4", silver hair, and behind him his security men carried a transparent chest packed with 20 million American dollars. The men who ran English cricket did not have him removed. They lined up to shake his hand and smiled for the photographers, because he had just offered them the largest prize in the history of team sport for a single match. Winner takes all, and all they had to do in return was believe him. Quite a lot of the cash in that box was reportedly fake. Prop notes, the kind used in films, bulking out the stacks so the pile would look right on camera. So was the man standing next to it. The knighthood was authentic, in the narrow sense that a sovereign country really did give it to him, though he had spent years and a fortune making sure it arrived. The bank was authentic in the sense that it had a headquarters and a logo and a gold eagle over the door. What it did not have was profits. Its financial statements were invented, worked backwards from whatever number would keep depositors calm that year. The accountant who signed them off ran a small firm out of an office on a North London high street, wedged between takeaway shops, and he died 7 weeks before the whole thing came apart. His name was Robert Allen Stanford. On Antigua they called him Sir Allen. He was the largest private employer in the country, and the owner of its newspapers. He lent its government money when it ran short, and he had the island's chief financial regulator on a retainer of cash bribes, sealed, according to sworn testimony, in a ceremony where the two men cut themselves and mixed their blood. 8 months after the helicopter, FBI agents found him at a house in Virginia belonging to his girlfriend. He had already tried to run. He called a private jet company, asked for a one-way flight to Antigua, and offered to pay with a credit card. They wanted a wire transfer. His accounts were frozen. The billionaire could not buy a seat on a plane. Behind him, he left close to 30,000 investors in more than 100 countries. Retired teachers, widows living off the interest, people who had chosen certificates of deposit precisely because they could not afford to take a risk. Many of them waited 15 years for a fraction of their money, and a lot of them died before it arrived. He was 62 years old when a federal judge sentenced him to 110 years in prison. He was not hiding either. American regulators suspected he was running a Ponzi scheme as early as 1997 and did nothing for 8 years, while the scheme grew from $250 million to $7 billion. A former employee wrote to them in 2003 and used the words Ponzi scheme and was ignored, and was then ordered to pay back her own signing bonus. All through that decade, Stanford got louder and more decorated, and every year that passed made him harder to touch. The fraud did not hide behind the wealth. The wealth was the hiding place. This is the story of how a man from a town of 7,000 people in Texas bought himself a country and a sport, ran the second largest Ponzi scheme in American history in plain sight for more than 20 years, and was finally cracked open not by the FBI or the SEC, but by one man with a laptop in Florida, doing a favor for a friend. It starts in Mexia. Chapter 1. The Man Who Wanted to Be Seen. Most con men hide. They keep their heads down. They shred the paper. They stay off camera. The whole art of the swindle is invisibility. You take the money and you disappear into the crowd. Allen Stanford did the opposite. He wanted to be the most visible man on earth, and he wanted his name on as much of it as he could get. The bank, the stadium, the newspapers, the airline, the cricket team, the trophy. He craved a title so badly, he engineered a knighthood. He claimed descent from the founder of Stanford University. People around him said he let it be quietly understood that he might have connections to American intelligence, an international man of mystery with secrets too dangerous to share. He had nothing of the kind. He was a small-town insurance man's son from a place of 7,000 people. That is the paradox at the heart of this whole saga. Stanford's greatest weapon was not secrecy. It was spectacle. He understood something most fraudsters never grasp, which is that if you make yourself grand enough and generous enough, Nobody checks the math. Who calls the police on the man who employs half the island? The bigger he got, the safer he became. Every trophy, every photograph with a politician, every stadium with his name across it was one more reason for a sensible person to assume that somebody else had already done the checking. One piece of housekeeping before we go back, because you will see two different numbers attached to this story, and both of them are correct. When the Securities and Exchange Commission first moved against Stanford in February 2009, it described an $8 billion scheme. That was the size of the certificate of deposit book, the money his bank claimed to be holding. When the Justice Department prosecuted him, the figure was $7 billion, the sum investigators could establish he had actually misappropriated. When the judge finally sentenced him, he ordered Stanford to forfeit $5.9 billion, 875.9. Take your pick. Every version of it is catastrophic. And when this film says billions, that is the ground we are standing on. Chapter 2. Mexia, Texas. Robert Allen Stanford was born on the 24th of March, 1950, in Mexia, Texas. If you have never heard of Mexia, you are not alone. Small town in Limestone County, a couple of hours south of Dallas, maybe 7,000 people in it when Allen was a boy. Flat land, big sky, oil under the ground and heat in the air. It is the kind of place people leave, and Allen Stanford would spend the rest of his life leaving it. Over and over, further and further, until he owned an island in the Caribbean and still wanted more. There was already a family business of a modest kind. Back in 1932, in the teeth of the Great Depression, Allen's grandfather Lotus Stanford founded the first Stanford Company right there in Mexia, a small insurance concern in a small town. That date matters, because Allen would spend the boom years of his empire invoking 1932 in glossy client magazines, presenting himself as the inheritor of a proud three-generation Texas institution. The seed of the legend went in a long way back. Allen's father, James, ran that insurance agency, dabbled in real estate, and eventually served as the mayor of Mexia. He was a fixture, a somebody in a town small enough that being a somebody didn't require very much. Allen's mother, Sammy, was a nurse. After the couple divorced in 1959, when Allen was 9, she moved with Allen and his younger brother Reed to Fort Worth and raised them there. Later, she wrote a society column for the local Mexia paper, which is a strange little detail to hold in your head, given that her son would one day host the society pages of an entire Caribbean nation. Nothing about the young Allen Stanford screamed destiny. He was a big, athletic, sociable Texas kid who liked working out, liked people, and liked money, in roughly that order. Eastern Hills High School in Fort Worth, then Baylor University in Waco, where in 1974 he graduated with a bachelor's degree in finance. A finance degree, that was it. The man who would one day be called a financial genius, who would claim returns that beat the greatest banks on Wall Street year after year, had one undergraduate qualification and an enormous appetite for being important. And his first real venture wasn't banking or investing. It was a gym. In the 1970s, young Allen Stanford opened a bodybuilding gym in Waco. He was into fitness, the mirrors and the iron and the swagger of it, and he thought he could build a business out of it. He could not. The gym failed. It failed so badly that in 1983, a court handed down a judgment against him for $31,800 in unpaid back rent. The man who would eventually be ordered to forfeit $5.9 billion started out getting sued over the rent on a failed gym in Waco, Texas. But the Stanford legend actually begins somewhere else, and it begins not with brilliance, but with timing. In the early 1980s, the Texas oil bubble burst. The boom that had inflated real estate across Houston collapsed violently. Property values cratered. Buildings that had been worth fortunes were suddenly worth cents. Owners were desperate. Banks were drowning in foreclosures. And for a certain kind of person, a catastrophe like that is an opportunity. Allen Stanford, with his father James as his partner, started buying. They bought depressed, distressed, dirt-cheap real estate across Houston, while everyone else ran for the exits. Buildings for pennies on the dollar. They held, they waited, and as the market healed through the decade, they sold. The recovery did the rest. What they bought in ruins, They sold in the sunshine, and they made a genuine fortune doing it. Real money. Legitimate money. This part gets skipped a lot, and it shouldn't. Alan Stanford's first fortune was real. He wasn't born rich, and he didn't inherit an empire. He and his father made an honest, savvy, well-timed killing in Texas real estate, and by the time James retired in 1993, Alan had taken over a company with 500 employees. So why did he do it? Why does a man who has proven he can make real money in the real world, legally, decide instead to build the biggest financial lie of his generation? That question is going to haunt everything that follows. And the first clue sits in a decision Alan made in the middle of that Texas real estate boom. A decision to leave the mainland behind and go somewhere warmer, somewhere looser, somewhere with far fewer rules. He went to the islands. Chapter 3. The Offshore Education. In the mid-1980s, while the real estate money was still flowing, Alan Stanford did the thing that turned out to be the hinge of his whole life. He opened a bank offshore. Not a real bank in the way you and I picture a bank. No marble lobby on Main Street. No teller windows. No line of ordinary people cashing checks. An offshore bank. On the tiny volcanic island of Montserrat in the eastern Caribbean, Stanford set up something he first called Guardian International Bank. You have to understand what offshore banking meant in that time and place, because it is the soil the whole fraud grew out of. Certain small Caribbean nations, hungry for revenue and short on industry, had worked out that they could sell something valuable to the rest of the world. Discretion. Set up shop here, they said, and we won't ask too many questions. Your depositors' names stay private. Your paperwork stays light. Your regulators stay friendly. It was a business model built in the space between the world's laws, in the gaps where money could sit quietly, out of reach of tax authorities and ex-spouses and creditors and prying governments. For a certain kind of client, that discretion was worth a premium. For a certain kind of banker, it was worth a great deal more, because the thinner the rules, the easier they are to bend. Montserrat didn't last. Around the turn of the 1990s, British authorities moved hard against the island's offshore banking industry, which had developed an unfortunate reputation as a haven for fraud and for shady operators. The party was getting raided. So Stanford did what he would do again and again whenever the ground got hot beneath him. He picked up and moved. He relocated to Antigua, a slightly larger independent nation in the same corner of the Caribbean, and rechristened the operation. Guardian International Bank became Stanford International Bank. His name on the door, on the letterhead, on everything. He also stepped in around 1990 to take over the island's troubled domestic Bank of Antigua, reportedly at the request of the Prime Minister, which gave him a foothold in everyday retail banking too. By 1991, he had pulled it all together under an umbrella called the Stanford Financial Group. On paper, it looked like this: a Houston-based financial services company with a glamorous international spine, an offshore bank in Antigua, brokerage and advisory arms in the United States, a growing web of offices that would eventually stretch across dozens of American states and more than a dozen countries, thousands of employees, a brand, a logo, a gold eagle. At the center of it sat Stanford International Bank, and the product that bank sold was deceptively boring. Certificates of deposit, CDs, the most vanilla, grandmotherly, risk-averse financial instrument in existence. You give the bank your money, you agree to leave it there for a set period, and in return, the bank pays you a fixed rate of interest. That's it. That's a CD. It is the financial equivalent of a savings bond, the thing you buy precisely because you don't want adventure. And that word, safety, was the master key to the entire fraud. Stanford wasn't selling risk. He wasn't pitching some exotic hedge fund strategy that might blow up. He was selling certainty, security, sleep at night, peace of mind. His CDs, he told the world, were as safe as money in an American federally insured account. Safer even. And here is the hook that would eventually catch tens of thousands of people. His CDs paid noticeably more than the ones down at your local bank. In late 2007, when American banks were offering somewhere around 4 to 5%, Stanford was advertising 7.5%. Same safety, more money. Who wouldn't want that? Nobody stopped to ask the only question that mattered. If it is truly that safe, how on earth is he paying that much? That question had an answer. He wasn't. There was no magic engine generating those returns. There never had been. The whole thing was hollow. To understand how hollow, how a man can take in billions of dollars and simply invent the profits, we need to open the machine up and look at the gears. Chapter 4. How the Machine Worked. Underneath the jets and the knighthood and the cricket, the mechanics of the con were almost insultingly simple. That is the dirty secret of nearly every great financial fraud. It isn't sophisticated. It just looks sophisticated to people who want to believe. A Ponzi scheme, named for Charles Ponzi and his postage stamp swindle in the 1920s, works like this. You promise investors big, steady, reliable returns. When the early investors want their interest paid or want to cash out, you don't pay them from profits, because there are no profits. You pay them with the fresh money coming in from newer investors, new money in the front door, straight out the back door to the older investors, who are thrilled and who tell all their friends how wonderful you are, which brings in even more new money, round and round. The scheme survives on one thing: momentum. As long as more money is coming in than going out, the machine keeps spinning, and everybody's statement shows a healthy, growing balance. The moment that flow reverses, the moment more people want out than are coming in, the whole thing collapses instantly, because there is nothing underneath it. A magic trick that only works while the audience keeps clapping. So how did Stanford dress that ancient trick up in a knight's costume? Start with the returns. His certificates of deposit paid rates that consistently, suspiciously, beat the market, reliably, year after year, through booms and busts, through good markets and terrible ones. His bank claimed smooth, strong, double-digit returns on its investments, and in the middle of the worst market year in living memory, it claimed to have lost barely more than 1%, while the S&P 500 shed nearly 40%. That is not the record of a genius. In the real world, where markets lurch up and down, that kind of consistency does not exist. Nobody is that good for that long. Not Goldman Sachs, not the greatest investors who ever lived. Nobody. Then the story. When clients or curious brokers asked how the bank did it, Stanford had a tale ready. A brilliant, globally diversified portfolio, managed by elite experts, recruited from the best schools and the best institutions, spread across markets and assets, in a proprietary strategy too clever for ordinary bankers to replicate. It sounded impressive. It was vapor, because Stanford International Bank was never the profitable enterprise it claimed to be. This came out later from the mouths of the people who ran the place. The financial statements, the glossy annual reports handed to depositors, the investment income, the portfolio figures, all of it. The government would eventually put it in the bluntest possible language. The bank's financial statements, including its investment income, were fictional, made up, invented. How do you invent a bank's profits? You reverse engineer them, and that is the regulator's own word for it. Stanford's inner circle would decide in advance what number the bank needed to show in order to look healthy and keep the confidence flowing, and then they worked backwards, fabricating the underlying figures to produce it. They started with the answer they wanted and manufactured the math to fit. One of the men at the very center of it later described it exactly that way, under oath. He called himself one of the liars who faked the numbers, and he said the chief faker of them all was Stanford. The third piece is the one that let it run for years: the audit. In the legitimate financial world, a bank holding billions of dollars gets examined by one of the giant global accounting firms, the kind with armies of auditors and reputations to protect. Antigua actually had offices of major international firms right there on the island. Stanford International Bank didn't use them. Instead, it had its books blessed by a tiny, obscure accounting outfit, a handful of small offices, one of them wedged into a North London high street between takeaway shops, run by an elderly accountant named Charlesworth Shelley Hewlett, a minnow signing off on a whale. One small, controllable auditor standing between the world and the truth. And when that auditor validated the fictional statements, everyone downstream took it as proof that all was well. The brokers, the clients, the regulators. There is a final twist to the auditor story that sounds invented. Charlesworth Hewlett, the one man who had personally signed off on those numbers year after year, died on the 1st of January 2009, age 73, weeks before the SEC moved in and the whole scandal broke open. When reporters descended on his firm's Antiguan office that February, the staff said they had no information about any relationship with Stanford at all. The current manager said he had never met the man in 10 years at the firm. The single human being who might have explained how a multi-billion-dollar bank's books came to be certified by a little firm in a quiet office was gone, right as the questions were about to start. That was the machine. Returns that were impossible, backed by a strategy nobody could see, recorded in books that were simply invented, and stamped by an auditor who answered to the man being audited. But a machine needs fuel, and the fuel of a Ponzi scheme is fresh money, which means fresh victims, which means salesmen. Here is where Stanford's real talent showed itself, and it was a talent for manipulation rather than finance. He built an army of brokers across the United States and beyond, financial advisors whose job was to steer their clients into those Antiguan CDs. And he made the incentives savage in their clarity, in the words of one advisor who lived through it, and who later said so under oath to the United States Senate. Those who sold the CDs were praised and compensated for doing so, and those who did not sell them were terminated. Every salesman in the building learns from that, and fast. Curiosity is expensive. Obedience pays. The doubters leave, the believers get rich, and what remains is a sales force perfectly optimized to funnel other people's life savings into a bank that was never what it claimed to be. All of them convinced they were selling something wonderful, because the man at the top had arranged for the only people left in the room to be the ones who didn't ask. That was the engine. Stanford still needed a kingdom to run it from, and he found one. A whole country, small enough to buy. Chapter 5. How to buy a country. To run a fraud like this, you need one thing above all else: to be left alone. Regulators who don't look too hard, laws that don't reach too far, and a government with every reason in the world to keep you happy. Antigua and Barbuda gave Alan Stanford all three, and he made sure of it. Not by hiding from the island's power structure, but by becoming it. Antigua is a beautiful place, and a small one. A twin island nation of well under 100,000 people, heavily dependent on tourism, without the deep industrial base of a larger economy. Into that world walked a Texan with a checkbook the size of the sky, and he did not spend it quietly. The Houston Chronicle would later describe him as the leading benefactor, promoter, employer, and public persona of the entire nation. His companies became the largest private employer on the island. His money built things, funded things, sponsored things. He lent the government millions. He built offices for the administration and paid for a hospital. He owned a chain of regional newspapers under the Sun banner, the Antigua Sun, and its sister titles across the Eastern Caribbean. So he wasn't only shaping the island's economy, he was helping shape the information its people received. He wove himself into the place so thoroughly that his prosperity and Antigua's prosperity started to look like the same thing. To move against Stanford was to move against one of the biggest engines of the national economy, which was the entire point. And then there was Leroy King. From around 2002, Leroy King was the administrator and chief executive of Antigua's Financial Services Regulatory Commission, the FSRC. In plain English, King was the man whose job was to watch banks like Stanford's, to examine the books, to review the bank's financial reports, to handle the questions that came in from foreign regulators. The fox, appointed to guard the henhouse. Instead, and he eventually admitted all of this in a United States courtroom, King took bribes to look the other way. He fed Stanford confidential information about what outside investigators were doing. He made false representations to regulators, including the SEC. He even let the FSRC's own letterhead be used for responses drafted elsewhere, so they would go out looking like the work of an independent watchdog. The details, when they came out, were close to operatic. King admitted that Stanford's cash payments to him came to roughly $520,000 over the course of the conspiracy. Some of it was allegedly routed through a secret Swiss bank account, so that when Stanford needed to grease the machinery, he could have his finance chief pull money out of a hidden numbered account overseas. There were gifts on top of the cash, including tickets to 2 Super Bowls, Houston in 2004 and Detroit in 2006, and repeated flights on Stanford's private jets. The strangest detail of all, the one that tells you what kind of theater Stanford lived inside his own head, was the blood oath. According to the man who became the government's key witness, sometime around 2003, Alan Stanford sat down with Leroy King and another Antiguan regulatory official and performed a brotherhood ceremony. They cut themselves and mixed their blood, sealing a pact. In exchange for regular cash bribes, King and the other official would make sure the Antiguan regulators never, and the phrase used was, killed the business. Never shut down the bank. Never let the truth out. A blood oath between a Texas fraudster and a Caribbean bank regulator, to keep a Ponzi scheme alive. Put that in a screenplay, and an editor cuts it for being too much. And it happened, and it worked, for years. With the government dependent on him and the regulators sworn to him in blood, Stanford held Antigua in his hand. But he wanted more than power over the island. He wanted the island to crown him. In November of 2006, it did. On the 1st of November 2006, during the nation's Silver Jubilee Independence celebrations, Robert Allen Stanford was appointed a Knight Commander of the Order of the Nation of Antigua and Barbuda, a genuine national honor from a sovereign country, and one he had been nominated for by members of the island's main opposition party. The announcement came at a grand ceremony, with an unmistakable air of royal legitimacy supplied by the presence of a member of the British royal family. Prince Edward, then Earl of Wessex, was in Antigua to represent the Queen, and he stood alongside the island's Governor-General, Sir James Carlisle. From that day forward, he was Sir Alan, and he used it constantly. Sir Alan to the Antiguans, Sir Alan to the international press, Sir Alan on the brochures and the bank statements and the letterhead. A knighthood is a shortcut to trust. It whispers, before you have even shaken the man's hand, that he has been vetted and honored and deemed worthy by people above you. When a retiree in Texas or a business owner in Venezuela sat across from a Stanford broker and heard the word "Sir," a little door in their mind swung open. Surely a knight has been checked out. Surely a knight is real. He was a knight. That part was true. But the man underneath the title had bought his way into it the same way he bought everything else, with other people's money. Now he had the kingdom and the crown, the machine humming, the money pouring in, the regulator in his pocket, the government at his side. Something was still missing. Alan Stanford didn't only want to be rich and powerful and knighted. He wanted to be adored, on a global stage, by millions. So he turned to a game he barely understood, played by hundreds of millions of people, and decided to buy it outright. He turned to cricket. Chapter 6. The Cricket Kingdom. Here is one of the strangest facts in a very strange story. Alan Stanford, a man from Texas, a country where almost nobody plays or watches or understands cricket, became for one blinding moment the single most important figure in the global game. To grasp why cricket was the perfect stage for him, you have to understand what cricket means in the West Indies. It isn't a sport there, it's identity and history, the arena where small island nations once stood over the mightiest teams in the world and beat them, over and over, and told a story about themselves that mattered far beyond any scoreboard. West Indian cricketers are legends, kings, gods, and by the 2000s, West Indian cricket had fallen on hard times. The money was thin, the glory was fading, the region's young talent was drifting away. Into that ache stepped Sir Alan Stanford, with a bottomless wallet and a savior's smile. In 2006, he created and funded his own tournament, the Stanford 2020. He built his own cricket ground in Antigua to host it, a gleaming venue with his name on it, sitting directly across from the arrivals hall of the island's main airport. So the first thing a visitor saw on landing was the Stanford name. The format was 2020, the shortest and flashiest version of the game. 3 hours of fireworks instead of 5 days of patience, tailor-made for spectacle. The first tournament, in the summer of 2006, drew teams from across the Caribbean. The second, in early 2008, was promoted as reaching a global television audience of 300 million people. 300 million, and note where that figure came from. Stanford's own publicity machine, which tells you something in itself. A convicted fraudster in waiting from Mexia, Texas, put on a cricket tournament that he could plausibly claim was watched by 300 million people, and for that moment he was hailed, genuinely and widely, as the visionary who would save West Indian cricket, the sport's American sugar daddy, its benefactor. He handed out prize money in cash and walked among the players like a monarch among his court. Then he decided to conquer England. In June of 2008, Stanford, the England and Wales Cricket Board, and the West Indies Cricket Board announced a deal reported to be worth around $100 million over 5 years, built around a marquee 2020 match each year between England and a team of West Indian All-Stars, branded, of course, the Stanford Superstars. The purse for that headline match stopped the sporting world cold. $20 million US, winner takes all, the richest payday in the history of team sport for a single game. Which brings us back to the helicopter. To launch the deal, Stanford flew to Lord's, landed on the nursery ground, hauled out that transparent chest of cash, and was greeted by the smiling chairman and chief executive of the ECB, who spoke about what a hugely exciting time this was for cricket. Pure Stanford. The ambush of spectacle, the vulgar theater of it, the money made physical so that everyone could see it and want it. The British press, to their enormous credit, were not charmed. They were appalled. This crass American, this cash-waving stranger, welcomed onto the most hallowed ground in the sport by men who should have known better, struck a lot of people immediately as a national embarrassment. But the ECB had signed. The money was too big to refuse. The centerpiece match came on the 1st of November, 2008. The 20 for 20 overs aside for $20 million, played at Stanford's own ground in Antigua. In the run-up to it, Stanford behaved less like a sponsor and more like a Roman emperor throwing a festival. He roamed the grounds. He wandered into the players' dressing rooms whenever he felt like it. He waved to crowds and treated the whole event as a personal carnival. And then came the moment that exposed the man beneath the myth. During a warm-up game between England and Middlesex, Stanford appeared on the ground's giant screen, grinning, one arm around Alistair Cook's girlfriend, bouncing another woman on his knee. That woman was Emma Pryor, the pregnant wife of England's wicketkeeper, Matt Pryor. Stuart Broad, who was bowling at the time, said that when the pictures went up on the big screen, there were a lot of gobsmacked people in the England side, and that Pryor was in a state of total shock. One England player told the Daily Mail that if that had been his wife on Stanford's lap, he would have wanted to punch him. Stanford, ever the salesman, phoned both Pryor and Kevin Peterson to apologize, and the apology was accepted. Just horsing around. That was Alan Stanford's whole life in 3 words. A man so drunk on his own performance that he would bounce a pregnant stranger on his knee in front of her husband's team, on a jumbotron, and call it fun. The match itself was almost beside the point, but for the record, England were bowled out for 99, and the Stanford Superstars chased it down without losing a wicket. The largest possible margin of victory, the West Indians walked away $20 million richer, splitting a fortune that had, unknown to every single person on that field, been stolen from tens of thousands of ordinary savers around the world. That is what curdles the whole spectacle. Every dollar of that legendary prize, and of the stadium and the tournaments and the broadcasts and the helicopter and the box of cash, came out of the same black hole. Victims' money, dressed up as generosity, performed as philanthropy, broadcast to the planet as the story of a great man's love for a great game. The cricket was the mask, and it was working perfectly. Masks are expensive, though. To understand how much money was pouring out the back of this machine, look at how Sir Alan Stanford actually lived. Chapter 7. The Life of a Fake King. At his peak, on paper, by the reckoning of the wealth list magazines, Alan Stanford was worth $2.2 billion. In 2008, he sat at number 205 on the Forbes list of the richest Americans. A billionaire, a knight, a mogul, a man who by any outward measure had won at life. And he spent like someone terrified that if he ever stopped spending, the illusion might catch up with him. In a very literal sense, that was true. A Ponzi scheme has to keep growing and keep dazzling and keep the confidence flowing, and nothing signals success like conspicuous, breathtaking, almost cartoonish excess. So take an inventory of the kingdom. The jets first. Not a jet, jets. A fleet of private aircraft reported at around $100 million worth of planes and helicopters. This is one of the details that should have screamed at everyone. The world's genuine financial giants might reasonably run a handful of aircraft, but a privately controlled financial group built around a small offshore bank in the Caribbean, issuing what were supposed to be simple, safe certificates of deposit? A fleet on that footing wasn't a sign of success. It was a sign that something, somewhere, did not add up. Stanford even had a helicopter widely described as gold-plated, the same one, or one of its cousins, that so scandalized lords. Then the yachts, plural, and attached to them one of the most absurd anecdotes in the whole affair. Stanford reportedly spent $12 million to have one of his yachts cut apart and lengthened by about 6 feet. Not to buy a bigger boat, to make an existing boat marginally longer. That is the economics of vanity. Pour a fortune in, watch sense come out. There was the private island, Maiden Island off the coast of Antigua, reportedly acquired for $63 million. There were the mansions in Houston and beyond, and there was the castle in Coral Gables, Florida, an 18,000-square-foot fantasy with, by some accounts, 57 rooms, a moat, and a tower. A moat! A grown man from Mexia, Texas, built himself a castle with a moat, because at a certain point the money stops being about comfort and starts being about myth. He wasn't buying houses. He was building a story about a king. Then there was the tangled, secret architecture of his personal life. Behind the public marriage, and he married Susan in the mid-1970s, had a daughter with her and later separated, Stanford kept what people inside his organization reportedly and chillingly referred to as his outside wives. Long-term relationships with multiple women, several of whom had children with him. By the time the story broke, the press was describing him as a father of 6. When his empire cracked open, one of the details that spilled out was a trust he had allegedly set up in the far-off Cook Islands, protected and hidden and offshore, naturally, for the benefit of one of these women and their children. Even his family life ran on the same operating system as his bank. Layered, concealed, structured to keep money and truth just out of anyone's reach. He developed a grandiose story about who he really was, too. In the early 2000s, he began claiming descent from Leland Stanford, the railroad baron and founder of Stanford University. He funded the restoration of a Leland Stanford mansion, saying he wanted to preserve an important piece of Stanford family history. He hired genealogists, who eventually produced a link of sorts. 6th cousins, twice removed. On one level, it was laughable social climbing. On another, it was the same instinct that drove everything else. The desperate need to be more than he was, to graft himself onto greatness, to manufacture a pedigree. Stanford University was not amused. The university said it was aware of no such genealogical relationship and eventually took legal action over the use of its name, arguing that Stanford was creating public confusion in a way that was injurious to the school. He wasn't a Stanford of the Stanford University Stanfords. He just wanted to be, so badly that he spent real money trying to force the world to agree. He let other myths circulate as well, including a quiet suggestion, never confirmed and never substantiated, that he might have connections to American intelligence. He didn't. But the rumor served him the way every myth served him, by making him seem deeper and more powerful and more untouchable than a small-town insurance man's son had any right to be. And in December of 2008, weeks before the whole structure came crashing down, World Finance magazine named Alan Stanford its Man of the Year. Man of the Year. The fake knight, the fictional financier, the reverse-engineered billionaire, crowned by the industry press at the edge of the cliff with the ground already crumbling under him. Because here is what almost nobody watching the helicopters and the yachts and the cricket understood. The warnings had already been sounding, loudly, for years. People had seen through him. Insiders had screamed. A whistleblower had written a letter that read like a prophecy. And the one institution whose entire job was to listen had hit the snooze button, again and again and again. To understand how Alan Stanford got away with it for so long, you have to meet the people who tried to stop him and failed. But first, you have to see what they were up against, because it wasn't just a charming billionaire with a good story. Chapter 8. the money, and the politicians. There is a version of this story that focuses only on the yachts and the cricket and the castle, the shiny stuff, the stuff that makes for great television. That version misses the most dangerous purchase Stanford ever made, because the smartest money he spent wasn't on jets or islands, it was on people, specifically on the people who make and enforce the rules. Every truly successful fraudster eventually learns that the most valuable asset in the world isn't cash. It's protection. And protection can be bought, not always with a briefcase of hundreds and a blood oath in the Caribbean, but with the polished, legal, respectable currency of political influence. In the United States, Stanford became a serious political player. He spread money across the system with the practiced hand of a man who understood that access is bipartisan and loyalty is for sale. In the years before his empire fell, he and his companies poured millions into American political campaigns and lobbying, aimed over time at both sides of the aisle. He cultivated relationships with lawmakers. He was known as a friend and travel agent to the powerful, the kind of man who could offer a ride on a private jet to a sunny Caribbean island. A little hospitality, a little FaceTime, the soft machinery of influence that rarely looks like corruption in the moment and only shows its shape in hindsight. One Antiguan businesswoman who serviced his aircraft remembered handling plane loads of senators and congressmen arriving on the island, and she said plainly what effect that had on local doubts. If American politicians were supporting a man like Mr. Stanford, then as far as anyone there could tell, he was good to go. Why would a man running an offshore bank care so much about American politics? Because the single greatest threat to an operation like his was regulation. Laws that would force offshore banks into the light. Rules demanding transparency, real audits, real disclosure, real oversight of exactly the kind of instruments he was selling. Anti-money laundering measures. Tax information sharing agreements between the United States and the little island nations where money went to hide. Every one of those reforms was a knife pointed at the heart of his machine, so Stanford spent and lobbied and befriended, and worked to keep the environment that made him possible exactly as it was, warm, murky, and friendly to men like him. Layer that on top of everything else. In Antigua, he had bought the regulator with cash and a blood oath. On the island, he had made himself the largest employer and the biggest benefactor, the man the government could not afford to cross. And in Washington, he was quietly greasing the gears of the very system that was supposed to protect American investors from people like him. Protection at every level, local and national and international. He hadn't only constructed a fraud, he had constructed a fortress around it, out of favors and dependency and influence, so that by the time anyone with power thought about moving against him, they would have to reckon with how many important people had shaken his hand, taken his money, or ridden on his plane. That is why the warnings we are about to get to went unheeded for so long. It wasn't only incompetence. Stanford had spent 2 decades making himself expensive to attack. And then there is the darkest shadow of all, the one that was never proven, which has never entirely lifted. For roughly a year before his empire collapsed, U.S. authorities had been investigating whether Alan Stanford's operation was connected to the laundering of drug money. Specifically, whether his financial network had been used to move cash for one of Mexico's most violent criminal organizations, the Gulf Cartel. Officials told ABC News that Mexican authorities had detained one of Stanford's private planes and found checks inside believed to be connected to the cartel. Be precise about what that is: an investigation, a line of inquiry, a suspicion, not a proven charge, and never part of the case that convicted him. He was convicted for the Ponzi scheme, for the fraud, for the stolen billions. The cartel question is a separate, murkier thread that was never tied off. But think for a second about why that thread exists at all. An offshore bank in a loosely regulated jurisdiction, promising discretion, moving enormous sums across borders with minimal scrutiny, run by a man who bribed his own regulator. Structurally, that is exactly the kind of institution dirty money is drawn to, the way water finds a drain. Whether or not the cartel connection was ever established, the plausibility of it tells you what Stanford had built. A machine so opaque and so protected, and so hostile to real oversight, that the world's most dangerous criminals could reasonably be suspected of using it, and nobody could easily prove they hadn't. That is the thing about operating in the shadows. You attract other things that live there. So this was what the whistleblowers were up against. A man wrapped in layers of purchased protection, political goodwill, national dependency, and deliberate opacity. When ordinary, honest people looked at Alan Stanford and saw a fraud and tried to say so out loud, they weren't just fighting a con artist. They were fighting a fortress. For years, the fortress won. Chapter 9. The Warnings Everyone Ignored. This is the part of the Alan Stanford story that should make you angriest. Not the greed. You almost expect the greed. What should make you furious is how many people saw it, said it, shouted it, and were ignored. Because Alan Stanford was not a criminal mastermind who outwitted a brilliant system. He was a fairly obvious fraud who exploited a broken one. The alarms went off. Nobody came. Start with Layla Weidler. Layla Weidler was a financial advisor at Stanford Group Company, hired in 2000. It did not take her long to sense that something was profoundly wrong with the certificates of deposit she was being pressured to sell. The returns didn't make sense. She repeatedly pressed the company for an honest appraisal of what actually backed the bank's assets, and was repeatedly denied it. She asked. They wouldn't tell her, and she refused to keep pushing a product she had come to believe was a lie onto the people who trusted her. For that refusal, in 2002, she was fired. Weidler didn't slink away. She went to the authorities. In late 2003, she sent a complaint to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the federal agency charged with protecting American investors, and in it, she laid the situation out with a clarity that is almost painful to read now. The company, she warned, was the subject of a lingering corporate fraud scandal perpetrated as a massive Ponzi scheme, and she used those exact words, one that would destroy the life savings of many, damage the reputation of all associated parties, ridicule securities and banking authorities, and shame the United States of America. She named it in 2003. One writer later called it a letter that should have woken the dead. It woke no one. She didn't stop either. She complained again in 2004, this time without anonymity, and met with SEC officials at the agency's Fort Worth office that September and December, handing over emails and documents and pointing out that the CDs were securities, which put them squarely inside the SEC's jurisdiction. Still nothing moved. Meanwhile, Stanford's machine kept roaring, pulling in billions more from thousands more people who would one day be exactly the victims Weidler had tried to warn. Her reward for telling the truth? A forced arbitration agreement meant she couldn't sue Stanford properly in open court. The arbitration process rejected her retaliation claim, and then ordered her to repay her $100,000 signing bonus. She told the truth, lost her job, was ignored by the government, and got billed for the privilege. She wasn't alone. A broker named Charles Hazlitt raised concerns about the impossibly high, impossibly consistent returns, and found himself pushed out soon afterwards. Two advisors, Charles Rawle and Mark Tidwell, resigned at the end of 2007 over what they described as the company's unethical and illegal practices, including the destruction of documents during an SEC investigation, and then fought a long, grinding battle as whistleblowers. Their lawsuit, filed in the days before the collapse, spelled out exactly how the bank had lied about its too-good-to-be-true CDs. So where was the SEC through all of this? That is the darkest threat of all, because the agency didn't just receive one warning and forget it. The SEC's own Inspector General later concluded, in a scathing 159-page report, that staff had suspected as early as 1997 that Stanford was probably running a Ponzi scheme. 4 separate examinations followed, in 1997, 1998, 2002, and 2004, and each one found that the CDs could not be legitimate. In each case, the report found, meaningful action was discouraged, partly because complex investigations were unpopular inside the agency. During the 8 years it took the SEC to act, the scheme grew from roughly $250 million to $7 billion. And when someone inside the SEC did try to do something about it, the system chewed her up too. Her name was Julie Pruitt, a longtime employee in the SEC's Fort Worth office. She pushed for years to get the agency to take Stanford seriously, fighting what she saw as her superior's weak and unwilling approach to exposing exactly this kind of scam. What did fighting the good fight from inside the government earn her? By her own testimony to Congress, a letter of reprimand, reassignment, a supervisor who, she said, would sometimes go weeks or months intentionally avoiding any contact with her at all. She paid, in her words, a heavy price, not for failing at her job, but for trying too hard to do it. Look at the full shape of this. On one side, an ecosystem of people who told the truth, Layla Weidler and Julie Pruitt, and Charlie Rawl and Mark Tidwell, and Charles Hazlitt, all of them fired or punished or sidelined or ignored or billed for their honesty. On the other, a fraud allowed to grow into the billions because the machinery of protection was too slow and too timid and too dazzled to move. Remember when this was all coming to a head? 2008-2009. The SEC was, at that exact moment, being publicly humiliated over another catastrophe it had missed, the collapse of Bernard Madoff's even larger Ponzi scheme, which had also been reported to the agency in detail for years by a whistleblower named Harry Markopoulos, who had practically drawn them a map. The regulators had been asleep at the wheel twice, on the two biggest investor frauds in the nation's history, at the same time. For years, that made Alan Stanford effectively untouchable, too rich to question, too decorated to doubt, protected by his own size. It would not be a government agency that finally cracked him open. Not the SEC, not the FBI, none of the powerful institutions that were supposed to be watching. It would be one man at a keyboard, doing a favor for a friend. Chapter 10. The Duck. In late 2008, a Venezuelan financial analyst named Alex Dalmady got a request from a friend. The friend had money parked in Stanford International Bank, a chunk of his savings sitting in those famous certificates of deposit, and he wanted to know whether it was safe. Could Alex take a look? Just as a favor, just to be sure. Dalmady was not a government investigator or a regulator. He was not part of any task force. By his own description, he was an amateur investor, 48 years old, living in South Florida, and he happened to know how to read a balance sheet. He went online, pulled the bank's published financials, and did the one thing that the powerful institutions of two continents had failed to do for over a decade. He looked at the numbers. It didn't take long. Within hours, the discrepancies were jumping off the page. The returns were too good, 7.5% on the CDs when U.S. banks were paying 4 to 5, with investment gains running between 10 and 14% year after year, smooth as glass, through market conditions that should have made any honest portfolio lurch and stumble. The growth was absurd. The bank's deposits had ballooned from $624 million in 1999 to more than $8.4 billion by the end of 2008, a compound growth rate of 34% that beggared belief. The staffing was impossible. A bank supposedly managing billions across a sophisticated global portfolio was being run by a tiny handful of people, with the actual investments overseen by even fewer, and with a board that included, in one of Dalmady's favorite details, an elderly cattle rancher and used car dealership owner. The auditor was a red flag by itself, that one small firm, when giants stood available right there on Antigua, and the business model was insane on its face. Take in deposits promising safety, then to fund those above-market payouts, gamble the money in the markets. Far too risky to ever guarantee the returns being promised. Dalmady wrote it all up. He gave the article a title that would become famous, DuckTales, and his conclusion was the plain, folksy, devastating logic of the barnyard. If it looks like a duck, and it walks like a duck, and it quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Stanford International Bank, he was saying, looked exactly like a fraud. It walked like one. It quacked like one. Everyone should stop pretending it might be a swan. He published it in the January 2009 issue of Veneconomy Monthly, a Venezuelan financial newsletter, a fairly obscure outlet in the grand scheme of global finance. He also gave his friend the only advice that mattered. Get your money out, as soon as possible. Then the strangest thing happened. The internet did what the SEC couldn't. The article got picked up by the Venezuelan financial blogs, then by English-language blogs, then by wider financial commentators. Within days, it had leapt from an obscure newsletter into the bloodstream of the global financial press. Bloomberg, Salon, the Times of London, the mainstream media that had spent years treating Sir Alan Stanford as a respectable mogul, was suddenly waking up to the possibility that the whole thing was a mirage. The timing could not have been worse for Stanford, because weeks earlier, in December of 2008, Bernard Madoff's colossal Ponzi scheme had detonated in New York, wiping out billions and terrifying every investor on Earth. The whole world had just been painfully educated about exactly what a Ponzi scheme looked like. Impossibly steady returns, a trusted name, a story too good to question. And here was an analyst holding up a Caribbean bank and saying, "This one too. Look at this one too." Investors started to get scared. In a Ponzi scheme, fear is the one thing that cannot be survived. The machine runs on confidence, on new money flowing in faster than old money flows out. And the moment the crowd stops clapping and starts reaching for the exits, the trick is over. The crowd started reaching for the exits. And Alan Stanford, Sir Alan, Man of the Year, savior of West Indian cricket, the knight with the castle and the moat, felt the ground open beneath him. After more than 2 decades, the greatest performance of his life was about to end. Not with applause, with federal agents at the door. Chapter 11. Two Kings Fall. To understand why Alan Stanford's world ended precisely when it did, you have to understand that he did not fall alone. He fell in the shadow of a bigger man, in the middle of the worst financial year in living memory. At the exact moment, the entire planet was learning to be afraid. Rewind to December 2008. The global economy is in freefall. The great financial crisis is at its terrifying peak. Banks collapsing, markets cratering, trillions in wealth evaporating, ordinary people watching their retirement accounts turn to ash. Fear is everywhere. Trust in the financial system is at rock bottom. And into that already panicked world drops a bombshell that will define the era. Bernard Madoff, a revered Wall Street elder and a former chairman of the Nasdaq Stock Exchange, confesses that his entire investment operation is a Ponzi scheme. Not a small one, the largest in history. Decades of steady, impossible, beautiful returns, all of it fictional. The most trusted name in a certain corner of finance is revealed overnight to be the most successful thief in it. Madoff's collapse did something to the world's psychology. For years, the phrase Ponzi scheme had been a bit of financial history, something from a textbook, Charles Ponzi and his postage stamps in the 1920s. After December 2008, it became a live, present, terrifying reality that everybody suddenly understood. People learned the warning signs practically overnight, the impossibly steady returns. The trusted insider. The story too good to question. The numbers that never wobbled even when the whole world was on fire. That new and painful literacy is exactly what doomed Alan Stanford. Because Stanford's returns were also impossibly steady. Stanford was also a trusted, decorated insider. Stanford's story was also too good to question. When that analyst in Florida looked at Stanford International Bank and said if it walks like a duck, it's a duck, the reason the world listened, the reason it spread like wildfire through the blogs and into the mainstream press within days, was that the world had just been burned by Madoff and was primed at last to see the pattern. Madoff taught everyone what a Ponzi scheme looked like. Then everyone looked at Stanford and saw the same silhouette. The two men became forever twinned in the public mind. Two great Ponzi kings, unmasked within weeks of each other, the two largest investor frauds in American history, surfacing back-to-back in the wreckage of 2008. Madoff first, the bigger fish, Stanford second, in his wake. The comparison cuts deeper than timing, though, and it cuts in a way that matters enormously for the people who lost everything. Because in almost every respect, Stanford's victims got the worst deal. Start with the fear that popped each bubble. Madoff turned himself in as redemption requests overwhelmed him in the crisis. Stanford was cracked open by an analyst's article and a bank run. Different triggers, same underlying cause. In a Ponzi scheme, panic is fatal, and 2008 was the most panicked year in generations. Both machines needed calm to survive, and 2008 offered none. Then look at the aftermath. And here is where the twins diverge cruelly. Because Madoff ran a U.S. brokerage, His victims fell under a federal safety net designed to protect brokerage customers. A court-appointed trustee waged a relentless, years-long campaign to claw back money from those who had profited from the fraud, and over time recovered a genuinely remarkable share of what victims had put in, the substantial majority of their lost principal. Stanford's victims had no such net. His certificates came from an offshore bank in Antigua, outside that protection entirely. When his money vanished, there was no federal backstop, no trustee with that kind of sweeping statutory power, no substantial recovery waiting a few years down the line. There was a receiver, picking through the ashes of an empire that its owner had already burned to the ground. So the two Ponzi kings fell together, in the same terrible season, brought down by the same collapse in trust. One left his victims with a lifeline. The other left his with almost nothing for a very long time. Madoff's name became the more famous, the bigger number, the Wall Street legend, the household word for financial betrayal. But if you were one of the ordinary people who trusted the wrong man, you were, in a sense, unluckier to have trusted Stanford. His crime was smaller. The wound it left ran deeper and healed slower. 2 frauds, 1 catastrophic year, and underneath both of them the same ancient, simple, unkillable lie, dressed up this time in a knight's costume. Now watch the fake knight's kingdom actually fall. Chapter 12. The Collapse. The end came fast, the way it always does. A Ponzi scheme can take 20 years to build and 20 days to fall, because the whole thing is a confidence trick, and confidence, once it breaks all at once. On the 17th of February, 2009, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the same agency that had ignored the warnings for so long, finally moved. It filed civil fraud charges against Robert Allen Stanford, against his lieutenants James Davis and Laura Pendergast Holt, and against his companies, and it went to court to freeze everything. That same day, federal agents raided Stanford's offices, the gleaming headquarters in Houston, and outposts in Memphis and in Tupelo, Mississippi. Customers who turned up at the Houston building found a sign on the door announcing that the firm was under the management of a receiver. The Gold Eagle empire, built over more than 20 years, was seized in an afternoon. At first, the SEC described it as a massive ongoing fraud centered on an $8 billion investment scheme. 10 days later, on the 27th of February, the agency amended its language to the phrase that would define the case forever. A massive Ponzi scheme. The bank's financial statements, the SEC said flatly, including its investment income, were fictional. And Allen Stanford? On the day his headquarters were raided, the great international man of mystery, the knight, the billionaire, tried to run. According to reporting at the time, Stanford contacted a private jet company that afternoon and tried to arrange a one-way flight out of the country to Antigua, to the island he owned, to the kingdom where a blood oath regulator might still protect him. He wanted to be gone within 3 hours. There was one small, almost comic problem. He tried to pay for the getaway flight with a credit card, and the jet company wouldn't take it. They wanted a wire transfer. The man with a fleet of his own aircraft, whose entire life had been an ode to money, was stopped at the last gate by the most mundane obstacle imaginable. His card wasn't good enough and his real money was already frozen. The fake king couldn't even buy his way off the board. 2 days later, on February 19th, FBI agents caught up with him. They found Sir Allen Stanford not in a castle or on a yacht or on a private island, but at a house near Fredericksburg, Virginia, connected to his girlfriend. By some accounts, he had spent the days of the collapse holed up in the basement of his girlfriend's mother's home. The agents served him with the SEC's legal papers. He was not arrested that day. That would come months later. But the performance was over. The emperor had no clothes, no jet, and now no exit. Meanwhile, around the world, the wreckage spread like a crack across ice. In Venezuela, where Stanford ran a local bank, and where citizens had reportedly poured billions into his scheme, panic hit. Investors rushed to yank their money out, tens of millions gone in 2 days, and the Venezuelan government stepped in, seizing Stanford Bank S.A. and guaranteeing depositors. In Antigua, small investors queued in the heat outside the Bank of Antigua to withdraw whatever they could, and the bank's checks were being refused in local supermarkets. On the 20th of February, the Eastern Caribbean Central Bank moved in and took the institution over, eventually folding it into a newly renamed bank. Ecuador seized local branches. Panama and other outposts followed. One by one, governments across the region grabbed what was left of Stanford's banks before they could collapse entirely and take ordinary depositors down with them. And in Antigua, in the middle of that chaos, the human cost arrived with brutal immediacy. Because Stanford wasn't only a banker to that island. He was the largest employer. He was the newspapers, the sponsorships, the loans, the jobs. When his empire fell, it didn't just take faraway investors' savings. It ripped a hole in the economy of an entire nation that had made the mistake of tying its fortunes to a man who was tying his to nothing at all. The kingdom collapsed in weeks. The reckoning, the courtroom, and the verdict and the sentence would take years. And before Alan Stanford ever faced a jury, he would try one last set of performances: the sick man, the amnesiac, the innocent victim of a government vendetta. He would need every one of them, because the people he trusted most were about to turn on him. Chapter 13. The Island He Broke. When we count the cost of Alan Stanford, we usually count the investors. The tens of thousands who bought the CDs, the retirees and widows, scattered across more than 100 countries. There is one victim in this story we tend to forget entirely, and it isn't a person, it's a place. Antigua. For more than 2 decades, Alan Stanford didn't only do business on Antigua. He became Antigua, or at least the beam the whole roof rested on. To understand the wound his collapse left, you have to understand how completely a nation of well under 100,000 people had woven its fortunes into one man's fraud. He was the largest private employer on the island. Thousands of Antiguans worked for Stanford, in his bank, his companies, his cricket operation, his newspapers, his sprawling empire of enterprises, right down to the restaurant and sports bar he owned. He paid first-world wages in a place that wasn't used to them. He built things and sponsored things. His cricket tournament put Antigua on the global sporting map and filled the island with a pride that money alone can't usually buy. He lent the government millions. He built offices for the administration and paid for a hospital. When Stanford threw a party, the island celebrated. When Stanford was knighted, it was a moment of national ceremony, presided over with royal pomp. He wasn't a foreign businessman parked offshore. He was, for a while, the closest thing that small nation had to a benevolent king. And like every relationship with Alan Stanford, it was built on a foundation of nothing. The cracks had begun to show a couple of years before the end. Early in 2007, Stanford and the Prime Minister of Antigua and Barbuda, Baldwin Spencer, once an ally, fell into a bitter public feud. The details were tangled, but the significance was clear. The man who had made himself indispensable to the island had also, inevitably, made himself a rival to its actual government. When your money grows bigger than the state, you don't only support the state, you start to threaten it. The relationship between the fake king and the real one had curdled into open conflict, a sign that Stanford's grip, however tight, was less stable than it looked. Then came February 2009 and the collapse, and for Antigua, this was not an abstract financial event happening somewhere far away. It was a bomb going off at home. The jobs evaporated. Thousands of Antiguans who had built their livelihoods around Stanford's enterprises suddenly faced ruin, in an economy far too small to absorb the shock, and the damage cascaded, because those employees in turn had to let go of their own helpers and gardeners and nannies. Some families emigrated to find work. His domestic bank faced a run, and regional authorities had to scramble to take it over and protect ordinary depositors before it went down too. His newspapers, once fixtures of the island's media, were eventually shuttered. The millions he had lent the government were tangled in the wreckage, and Antigua's international reputation as a place to do financial business, already fragile given its offshore banking history, took a devastating blow. All of it landed at the worst possible moment, as the global financial crisis was already hammering an economy where more than 70% of activity depends on tourism. There is a genuine moral complexity here, and an honest documentary has to sit with it rather than skip past it. Were the Antiguans who embraced Stanford victims or enablers? The answer is both, and neither, and it depends entirely on which Antiguan you mean. The regulator who took the bribes and swore the blood oath was a criminal, plainly, and he would eventually go to prison for it. But the thousands of ordinary Antiguans who simply took jobs, who cheered the cricket, who felt pride that a global figure had chosen their island, were exactly as deceived as the retirees in Texas, and they paid a national price for it. An entire country had been invited to believe in a man, had believed, and then watched that belief detonate their economy. So in the aftermath, Antigua did the one thing left to do. It took back the crown it had given him. In the autumn of 2009, 3 years after that Silver Jubilee ceremony, the National Honors Committee voted unanimously to strip Alan Stanford of his knighthood, its chairwoman saying plainly that he had embarrassed the nation. The paperwork took a while longer. On the 1st of April 2010, Governor-General Dame Louise Lake Tack signed the order formally revoking the honor. Sir Alan Stanford, Knight Commander of the Order of the Nation, was unknighted by the very nation that had knighted him. It was, in its way, the most fitting verdict of all, delivered not by an American jury, but by the island he had broken, a nation looking at a man it had once called Sir, seeing at last exactly what he was, and taking the title back. Chapter 14. The Reckoning. A federal grand jury in Houston returned its indictment against Robert Alan Stanford on the 18th of June 2009, and Stanford surrendered to the FBI that day. A week later, he stood in a Houston courtroom and pleaded not guilty to a sprawling 21-count indictment. Fraud, conspiracy, money laundering, obstruction. It named him alongside his chief investment officer, 2 of his accountants, and the Antiguan regulator, Leroy King. Convicted on everything, prosecutors noted, he could theoretically face something on the order of 250 years in prison. He was denied bail. A judge ruled that a man with private jets, offshore accounts, foreign citizenship, and every incentive to flee was exactly what the phrase flight risk was invented for. Sir Alan Stanford was going to sit in jail and wait for his trial. What a long, strange wait it turned out to be. First, the violence. In late September of 2009, Stanford was hospitalized after being beaten by another inmate at the detention facility where he was being held. He suffered a concussion. The man who had spent decades cushioned by wealth, insulated by staff and security, and the deference of an entire nation, was now just another inmate in a cell, and the protective bubble of his money was gone. Then the medical and mental drama. His lawyers argued that Stanford had become addicted to anti-anxiety medication behind bars, and that the addiction had impaired his judgment so badly he wasn't fit to stand trial. A judge agreed, at first, and Stanford was sent for treatment. His defense team then claimed something even more dramatic, that the beating had left him with memory loss, that he genuinely could not recall the events at the heart of the case, that he was incompetent to be tried at all. A bold play. The fraudster who could no longer remember his own fraud. After evaluation and treatment, in December of 2011, the judge ruled him competent. The trial would proceed. But the most devastating blow to Alan Stanford didn't come from a prosecutor or a judge. It came from the man who had stood beside him for the entire ride, James Davis. Davis had known Stanford since their college days. They were roommates at Baylor. For years, Davis served as chief financial officer of Stanford International Bank and the Houston-based Stanford Financial Group, one of the most senior figures in the empire, the man whose hands were on the books. And when the government came for him, Davis did the thing Stanford surely never believed he would do. He confessed. In August of 2009, he pleaded guilty. Then he agreed to testify against his old friend. On the witness stand, he peeled the whole thing open from the inside. He admitted he had known about Stanford's misuse of the bank's assets, and had worked to keep it hidden from the public and from almost everyone else in the company. He told the jury the numbers were fabricated, that he and Stanford had faked figures in the reports and documents shown to depositors. He described the reverse engineering, the working backwards from the number they needed to the fiction that would produce it. He admitted he was one of the liars, and pointed at Stanford as the chief faker. He testified about the bribes, the hush money flowing to the Antiguan regulator, the loans to the island's government. He described being sent to London to fax a reassuring letter to a nervous client from the office of a bogus insurance company. And he described, in a genuinely surreal courtroom moment, the blood oath. the ceremony where Stanford and the regulator cut themselves and mixed their blood to seal the pact that kept the fraud alive. When a prosecutor asked why he had kept doing it, year after year, even once he knew, his answer was almost unbearably human. He said he wanted to please Stanford. He said he was a coward. He said he was embarrassed, and that Stanford signed his paycheck. It was the confession of the whole organization in miniature. A decent enough person who let the money and the fear and the desire to please a powerful man carry him past every line he should have refused to cross. That was the engine Stanford ran on. Not only his own greed, everyone else's weakness. The trial began in late January of 2012, before U.S. District Judge David Hittner in Houston, and ran about 6 weeks. The prosecution laid out the fictional bank, the stolen billions, the diverted loans. Stanford had funneled well over $1 billion in secret personal loans to himself, out of the very bank he told depositors was rock solid. The defense tried to argue that investors had received adequate disclosure and that any wrongdoing belonged to Davis. The jury didn't buy it. On the 6th of March 2012, they convicted Robert Allen Stanford on 13 of the 14 counts against him, sparing him on a single count of wire fraud. After a fraud spanning more than 20 years and more than 100 countries, the verdict came down with brutal efficiency. Sentencing came on the 14th of June, and it was its own kind of theater to the very end. Prosecutors asked for 230 years. Stanford's own lawyers argued for something close to time served, 3 years, the stretch he had already spent in custody awaiting trial. 2 visions of justice, separated by more than 2 centuries. And Stanford himself, given the chance to speak, did not repent. He talked for close to 40 minutes. He said he wasn't there to ask for sympathy or forgiveness, and then told the court, from his heart, that he hadn't run a Ponzi scheme and hadn't defrauded anybody. He insisted that but for the government's interference, he could have paid off every depositor with substantial assets left over. He described the injuries he had suffered in prison. He condemned what he called the government's Gestapo tactics in seizing his companies. He reminisced about riding horses with a former president of the United States. Cornered, convicted, facing the end of his life in a cell, the performance continued. He was still the wronged visionary, still the victim, still, in his own mind, Sir Alan. The prosecutor, William Stelmach, rose and called that version of events obscene. This, he told the court, is a man utterly without remorse. From beginning to end, he said, Stanford had treated all of his victims as roadkill. He went after the middle class, after people who didn't have money to lose. People had lost their homes. People had come out of retirement. Judge Hittner was not moved either. He said he had read every one of the 350 victim letters sent to the court. He called it one of the most egregious criminal frauds ever presented to a jury in federal court, and said Stanford had ruined the lives of thousands of victims all over the world. Then he sentenced Allen Stanford to 110 years in federal prison and ordered him to forfeit $5.9 billion. 110 years. For a man in his 60s, that isn't a number. It's a certainty. It meant he would die in prison, with an earliest theoretical release date set generations into the future, a date no living version of Allen Stanford would ever see. The night was finished. His victim's story was only beginning, because a conviction doesn't give anyone their money back. Chapter 15. The People Who Helped Him. One man cannot fake a bank. That is worth stopping on, because it is easy to tell this story as though Allen Stanford were a lone monster, a single villain who dreamed up a lie and executed it by force of personality. A fraud of this size, spanning decades and continents and billions of dollars, is never the work of one person. It requires accomplices, accountants who cook the books, executives who sign the documents, advisors who sell the product, and a whole culture of people who at some level choose not to look too hard at what they are part of. So who were these people? And here is the more unsettling question, the one that should make every one of us a little uncomfortable. Were they monsters too, or were they ordinary people who got pulled, one small compromise at a time, into something they could never have imagined agreeing to on day one? The truth sits somewhere in between, as it usually does. And the people around Stanford offer a chilling little seminar in how good, normal, capable human beings become the machinery of a catastrophe. Take the man closest to the center, the finance chief, the college roommate, the friend of decades. This was not some hardened criminal Stanford recruited from the underworld. This was a man who had known him since university, who had built a life and a career alongside him, who made a great deal of money over the years, and who confessed in the end to helping fake the numbers that held the whole fraud together. When prosecutors asked him why he kept going once he knew, his answer wasn't a villain's answer. It was painfully, recognizably human. He wanted to please Stanford. He was a coward. He was embarrassed, and Stanford signed his paycheck. Read those reasons again, because they are the reasons ordinary people go along with terrible things everywhere, in every organization, in every era. The desire to please a powerful boss, the fear of confrontation, the embarrassment of admitting you were part of something wrong, the brutal simple fact of the paycheck, the mortgage, the family, the life that depends on not rocking the boat. Those are not the motives of a criminal mastermind. They are the motives of a middle manager who took one step too far, and then another, and then found there was no way back that didn't cost him everything. Laura Pendergast Holt, the chief investment officer, is a different flavor of the same tragedy. She had risen fast and high inside Stanford's world, entrusted on paper with overseeing the very investments supposedly generating those miraculous returns. In January 2009, with the SEC demanding testimony and documents about the bank's entire investment portfolio, she gave the regulators assurances about holdings she was in no real position to account for. She was charged with obstruction, pleaded guilty, and went to prison for it. That single fact invites a reasonable inference. Here was someone placed at the top of a structure whose deepest secrets were kept from her by the handful of men who really ran the money. Based on what the record shows, we can read her as a person who climbed to a position of enormous responsibility faster than her actual knowledge could support, and who then obstructed investigators rather than admit how little she truly understood about where the billions were. Her case raises the question that hangs over so many corporate frauds. How much did she actually know, and how much did she simply choose not to find out? Willful blindness is its own kind of participation. The decision not to ask a question you are afraid to hear answered is still a decision. The accountants were Gilbert Lopez, the chief accounting officer, and Mark Kurt, the global controller. Their job was to translate Stanford's fictions into the sober, credible language of financial statements, and the SEC said flatly that they reverse-engineered the bank's numbers to report income that did not exist. They received 20-year sentences, among the longest of anyone in the whole affair. In a fraud built on fake numbers, the people who make the fake numbers look real are not peripheral. They are load-bearing. Without a plausible balance sheet, the illusion falls apart. The accountants made the lie legible. There is a detail in the government's filings that captures the whole atmosphere. As the walls closed in, the men handling the sensitive financial information developed elaborate rituals to keep it away from investigators. They moved it onto a portable hard drive they nicknamed the football. They wiped it off U.S. servers. They flew paper files down to Antigua on the company jets to be burned. That is not the behavior of confused executives who didn't quite realize what they were part of. What ties all of these people together is a phenomenon psychologists and criminologists see again and again in white-collar crime. Almost nobody wakes up one morning and decides to help steal billions of dollars. Instead, they cross a small line, a slightly aggressive assumption, a number nudged in the right direction, a question left unasked, a document signed with a knot in the stomach. Crossing that first small line makes the second one easier, because now you are already implicated, and turning back means admitting the first one. Step by step, compromise by compromise, the distance between who you were and what you are doing grows so gradually that you never feel the moment you became a criminal. You just look up one day and realize you are testifying in a federal courtroom about a blood oath. Stanford was a master at exploiting exactly this. He built a culture where loyalty was lavishly rewarded and curiosity was punished. He surrounded himself with people who owed him their wealth and their status and their whole sense of importance, people who therefore had every incentive to keep believing, or at least to keep quiet. He didn't need to recruit villains, he needed capable, ambitious, ordinary people, paid extraordinarily well, and then he let the slow gravity of complicity do the rest. That is the quietly terrifying lesson buried in the wreckage of Stanford Financial. The fraud didn't require a building full of evil people. It required a building full of normal ones, people not so different from you or me or anyone we know, who each made a series of small, understandable human choices, and who woke up too late to find they had helped build a monster. Chapter 16. The Human Cost. It is very easy, in a story this large, to get lost in the spectacle. The jets, the cricket, the castle with the moat, the blood oath, the helicopter. $7 billion is such an enormous abstract number that it starts to feel unreal, like monopoly money, like a figure in a movie. So make it real. Who actually paid for all of it? Stanford's certificates of deposit were sold, over the years, to something on the order of 20 to 30,000 investors. The Justice Department's own filings speak of nearly 30,000 people, spread across more than 100 countries. These were not, for the most part, hedge funds or billionaires or sophisticated speculators who understood they were gambling. They were the opposite of that. They were exactly the people who buy certificates of deposit in the first place. Cautious people, careful people, people who did not want risk. They were retirees who had handed over the savings of an entire working life. Widows living on the interest. Small business owners, teachers, engineers, families, who had done everything right, who had saved instead of spent, who had chosen the safe option, who had specifically sought out an investment marketed as secure, precisely because they could not afford to lose it. They were told, again and again, by trusted advisors, that this was as safe as a government-insured account, safer. And they believed it, because a knight was standing behind it, and knights don't steal. When the machine collapsed, those people didn't lose a portion of their wealth. Many lost everything. The nest egg, the retirement, the house money. The kids' inheritance, gone overnight into jets and yachts and cricket matches, and a moat. In Arkansas alone, one state, not a large one, investors lost more than $50 million. And here is the cruelest part, the thing that separates the Stanford victims from almost every other group of fraud victims in modern American history. For years, they got almost nothing back. To understand why, compare Stanford to his shadow, Bernie Madoff. Madoff's fraud broke open 2 months before Stanford's and was even larger, but Madoff's victims were, in a strange way, luckier. He ran a U.S. brokerage, which meant his customers were eligible for a specific kind of federal protection designed to compensate people when a brokerage fails. A court-appointed trustee clawed back staggering sums from those who had profited, and over the years, Madoff's investors recovered a remarkable share of their principal. Stanford's victims got no such lifeline, because his CDs were issued by an offshore bank in Antigua, not a U.S. brokerage, not a U.S. bank, not covered by American deposit insurance. They fell into a gap. No federal insurance stood behind them. No dedicated safety net caught them. When their money vanished, there was no backstop, only whatever assets could be scraped together from the ruins of an empire whose owner had been one of the most spectacular spendthrifts imaginable. A court appointed a receiver, a lawyer named Ralph Janvey, to hunt down whatever was left and try to return it. The receivership became its own long, agonizing, controversial saga because there simply wasn't much left to find. Stanford hadn't stashed the money in a vault. He had burned through it, into money-losing businesses, into cricket, into the jets and the yachts and the castle, into the bribes, into the outside wives, into the endless performance of being a great man. When the estate's assets were finally sold off, the auctions were picking over office furniture, an antique desk, a crystal eagle, a stash of handguns bought to arm a private security detail. Much of the money was simply, permanently gone. For years the recovery crawled. Early on, the amounts returned to victims came to pennies on the dollar, in some accounting less than a single penny for every dollar lost. Meanwhile, the receivership itself racked up enormous fees and expenses, hundreds of millions of dollars flowing to the lawyers and professionals doing the untangling, which enraged victims who watched the recovery of their stolen savings become another expensive machine in its own right. Some of them felt they were being victimized a second time. Some of them didn't live to see any of it. The recovery dragged on so long, well over a decade, that a meaningful number of the retirees who lost everything died waiting for money that came too late, or never came at all. Others, desperate and old and out of time, sold their claims to hedge funds for cents on the dollar just to get something in their remaining years. There was eventually a measure of justice on the financial side, though it took an astonishingly long time. Years of litigation focused not only on Stanford, but on the big banks that had handled the money along the way, on the theory that they should have seen the red flags. In February 2023, days before trial, 5 banks agreed to settle, collectively about $1.6 billion. Toronto Dominion alone agreed to pay $1.205 billion, while denying any liability or wrongdoing. Combined with the receiver's earlier recoveries of more than $1.1 billion, the total clawed back climbed past $2.7 billion. Even then, the money didn't move quickly, because Stanford himself filed objections and appeals from prison, right up to a petition to the Supreme Court, delaying payment to his own victims by months. But do the math against the loss. Those hard-won recoveries, spread across tens of thousands of victims and net of enormous legal costs, still represent a fraction of what was stolen. For the school teacher who lost her retirement, for the couple who lost the money they had saved for 40 years, a fraction, eventually, after 15 years, and only if you lived long enough, is not justice. It is a wound that never fully closes. That is the true weight of Alan Stanford. Not the $7 billion number, the tens of thousands of front doors it walked through, in more than 100 countries, belonging to ordinary careful people who trusted a knight and paid for his moat with their futures. Chapter 17. Where they all landed. 5 other people were convicted for their roles in the scheme, with sentences ranging from 3 years to 20. His college roommate and finance chief, James Davis, whose testimony helped bury Stanford, had pleaded guilty and cooperated. The judge noted that over 3 years he provided substantial assistance, testifying against Stanford and against the accountants, and preparing to testify against the chief investment officer. He faced up to 30 years. In January 2013, he got 5, plus $1 billion money judgment. The classic bargain of the collapsing conspiracy. The insider who turns first and talks most walks away with the least. He served his time and was released in 2017. Laura Pendergast Holt pleaded guilty to obstruction and was sentenced in September 2012 to 3 years. Gilbert Lopez and Mark Kurt, the chief accounting officer and the global controller, were convicted at trial and in February 2013 were each sentenced to 20 years. The men who ran the numbers paid for the numbers. Leroy King, the Antiguan regulator, Stanford's blood brother, the fox who guarded the henhouse, did not escape either, though it took a decade. King fought extradition from Antigua for years, at one point with a multi-million-dollar reward posted for his arrest. But in November 2019, he was extradited to the United States. He pleaded guilty in January 2020 to conspiracy to obstruct justice and obstruction of justice, and on the 24th of February 2021, he was sentenced to 10 years in prison plus 3 years of supervised release. He was the last defendant in the case to be convicted, and the last to be sentenced. The blood oath had promised protection. It delivered a cell. As for Robert Allen Stanford, he is, as of this telling, still alive, still in prison, and still insisting he did nothing wrong. His appeals failed. He filed a lengthy challenge to his conviction and his sentence, and the Federal Appeals Court rejected it in 2015 and upheld both the conviction and the 110-year term. The Supreme Court declined to take up his case. His direct road out of prison closed entirely. He is held at the United States Penitentiary Coleman II in Coleman, Florida, part of one of the largest federal prison complexes in the country. His official release date is listed as the 13th of March, 2103, which for a man born in 1950 is another way of writing the word never. From prison, over the years, he has kept maintaining his innocence and kept litigating, filing the objections that delayed hundreds of millions of dollars from reaching the people he defrauded. He has given the occasional interview. He has expressed, in his own strange way, a kind of wistfulness about it all. About the cricket. About the embarrassment he caused English cricket. About the good relationships he felt he had with the officials who once lined up to welcome his helicopter. He talks like a man who believes he was a great benefactor brought down by his enemies, rather than a thief who spent other people's retirements on a castle with a moat. Whether that is genuine delusion or the final unbreakable layer of a lifelong performance, nobody can really say. Perhaps after enough decades inside your own myth, there stops being a difference. The private island, the jets, the yachts, the castle, the newspapers, the cricket ground with his name on it, all of it seized, or sold, or scattered, or abandoned. And the knighthood that Antigua bestowed with such ceremony in 2006 was formally stripped away. He was, by then, quite literally a fake knight, a man who held a real title and had it taken from him because of what he truly was. Sir Alan Stanford, in the end, was neither. Chapter 18. Did he always intend it? There is a question sitting underneath this entire story, and it is more interesting and more disturbing than it first appears. Did Alan Stanford set out to build a Ponzi scheme, or did he start with something real, something legitimate, and slowly, fatally, cross over into the lie? Remember where he came from. His first fortune was genuine. He and his father made real money, legally, in Texas real estate, reading the oil bust correctly and buying low and selling high. That wasn't fraud. That was skill and nerve and timing. Alan Stanford, at the start, was a man who could actually make money in the real world, which is what makes the whole thing so strange. Why would a man who has proven he can win honestly choose instead to build the biggest lie of his life? Here is where the answer gets dark. According to the sworn account his own finance chief later gave, the rot went back almost to the very beginning. In that testimony, the false reporting, the fake numbers, the invented profits, stretched all the way back to Stanford's earliest offshore days in the 1980s, to the little bank on Montserrat, long before it was renamed and moved to Antigua, long before the knighthood and the cricket and the castle. That is the account of a cooperating witness with every incentive to be helpful to the government, rather than a settled fact of the historical record. But if it is accurate, the implication is stark. This was never a legitimate bank that later went bad. It was built crooked from the foundation. Even that doesn't fully answer the question of intent, because there is a particular psychology to this kind of fraud worth understanding. Very few Ponzi schemers sit down at the start and coldly plan to steal for 30 years and then get caught. Many of them start with a promise they can't quite keep, a return they have guaranteed but can't legitimately generate, and rather than admit failure, they cover the gap. Just this once, just until the real profits come in. They take a little new money to pay the old promises, telling themselves it's temporary, a bridge, a stopgap until the strategy comes good. The strategy never comes good, because it was never real. And now they're trapped, because the moment they stop taking new money to pay old promises, the whole thing collapses and everyone finds out. So they take a little more, and a little more. The hole gets bigger, and the only way to hide a growing hole is to grow the operation even faster, take in even more, promise even more, until they're running as hard as they can just to stay in the same place, and the fraud has become a treadmill they can never step off, because stepping off means the end. Based on how these schemes almost always unfold, the likeliest reading of Alan Stanford goes something like this, and it is an interpretation rather than a documented confession, because he has never admitted any of it. Not a criminal genius executing a master plan. A gambler who made a promise he couldn't keep, papered over the gap, and then spent the next quarter-century sprinting to stay ahead of a collapse he knew, on some level, was always coming. It would explain the frantic, ceaseless spectacle. The cricket, the jets, the knighthood, the castle. In a Ponzi scheme, growth isn't greed. Growth is survival. Every dazzling new display brought in the new money that paid the old money. He couldn't stop being spectacular, because the instant he stopped, the music stopped, and the whole thing came crashing down. Look at it that way and the fake king starts to resemble a man riding a tiger. He couldn't get off. He had built a machine that had to keep growing or die, so he fed it, with cricket matches and helicopter stunts and knighthoods and a private island, right up to the moment in early 2009 when the new money finally stopped coming in and the tiger turned around. Does any of this excuse him? Not for a second. Whatever the psychology, whatever the origin, he knew. He knew what the bank really was. He knew the statements were fictional. He knew the retirees trusting him with their life savings were being lied to. The treadmill may explain how a real businessman became a monster. It does not make him any less of one. But it leaves us with the most unsettling thought of all. Alan Stanford could have been legitimately wealthy. He had the talent for it. He had already done it once. And he threw it away. The honest fortune, the real success, the life he could have had, for the intoxicating, impossible dream of being a knight and a king and a legend, a man too big to question. Everything about the way he lived points to the same reading. He didn't defraud tens of thousands of people because he had to. He did it because being merely rich was never going to be enough for a small-town insurance man's son from Mexia who needed the whole world to bow. The lie wasn't about the money in the end. The money was just how you keep score. The lie was about the crown. Chapter 19. The Anatomy of a Lie. Strip away the spectacle, and what actually made Alan Stanford's fraud work for more than 20 years? The answer isn't really about accounting. It's about human beings, how we trust, what we fall for, and why the smartest people in the room can be the easiest to fool. These are the same techniques fraudsters are using on people right now, today, and understanding them is the only real armor any of us has. The first tool was consistency. Real investments go up and down. Markets lurch. Honest portfolios have bad years. Stanford's returns never did. They were smooth and steady, and reliably a little better than everyone else's. Year after year, including a year when the S&P 500 fell nearly 40%, and his bank claimed to have lost barely one. To an unsophisticated investor, that smoothness looked like safety. In reality, smoothness is the loudest alarm bell in all of finance. Reality is not smooth. When someone shows you a straight, gently rising line through every kind of market, you are not looking at genius. You are almost certainly looking at a lie, because the only way to make returns that smooth is to make them up. Stanford and Madoff both sold that same impossible smoothness. It is the fingerprint of the Ponzi. Authority came next. Stanford didn't ask you to trust him. He arranged for the whole world to trust him first, so that by the time you sat down across from his broker, the work was already done. He was a knight, vetted surely by someone important, a Forbes billionaire, a man of the year, the savior of a beloved sport, photographed with royalty and politicians and legends. Each of those credentials was a borrowed piece of legitimacy, and stacked together, they built a wall of credibility so high that no ordinary person felt qualified to question it. Who are you to doubt a knight? That was the entire psychological engine. He made doubting him feel absurd. Generosity was the third weapon, and it might be the ugliest. Stanford gave lavishly and publicly and constantly. To Antigua, to cricket, to politicians, to charities, to everyone in his orbit. Generosity disarms people. A man who gives so freely can't possibly be stealing, can he? But he wasn't giving away his money. He was giving away yours. Every act of public generosity was funded by the victims, and every act of public generosity made the next victim trust him more. The philanthropy wasn't separate from the fraud. It was part of it. The marketing budget of a criminal enterprise. Fourth came complexity, used as camouflage. Anyone who asked how the returns were possible got a story about sophisticated global diversification, proprietary strategies, expert management, analysts from Harvard and Princeton. Language designed not to explain, but to intimidate. The message underneath the jargon was always the same. This is too complicated for you to understand, so stop trying and trust the experts. Real experts can explain what they do simply. Fraud hides behind fog. And the last one, the piece that let it run so catastrophically long, was captured oversight. The people who were supposed to catch him didn't, because he had made sure they wouldn't. The auditor was a tiny firm he controlled. The regulator was bribed and sworn in blood. The government of Antigua was financially dependent on him. And the American regulators who might have stopped it were too slow and too timid, and too dazzled by his size to act on suspicions sitting in their own files since 1997. He didn't defeat the watchdogs, he bought some, distracted others, and simply outgrew the rest. Put those five together, impossible consistency, and borrowed authority, and weaponized generosity, and protective complexity, and captured oversight, and you don't only have the anatomy of Alan Stanford. You have the anatomy of nearly every great financial fraud in history. The names change, the stage changes, the costume changes, sometimes a knight in the Caribbean, sometimes a crypto wizard, sometimes a family friend at the country club. The machine underneath is always the same. The defense against it is always the same too, and it is almost painfully simple. It is the question that the powerful institutions of two continents somehow couldn't bring themselves to ask, and that one amateur analyst at his keyboard asked in an afternoon. If it's really that safe, how is it paying that much? If nobody can answer that in plain language, if the answer is a story, or a shrug, or a wall of jargon, or the sheer overwhelming grandeur of the man asking you to trust him, then you already have your answer. It's a duck. Chapter 20. The Last Performance. He is in a prison cell in Florida now, an old man insisting to anyone who will listen that he did nothing wrong, running out the clock on a sentence that will outlive him by decades. The castle sold, the moat dry, the jets grounded. The cricket ground he built still standing across from the airport, with his name on it, over an empire of dust. And the performance has not stopped. That is the part that should stay with you. Every objection he filed from that cell, every appeal, every petition all the way up to the Supreme Court, delayed the money reaching the people he stole it from. He was still costing them something in 2024. He is probably costing them something today. So the next time somebody offers you an investment that is completely safe and pays more than everyone else's, the next time the returns look a little too smooth, the man behind them a little too grand, the story a little too complicated to question, the next time you feel that small, quiet pull of doubt, and then hear a voice telling you that a man this important and this successful and this decorated could not possibly be lying to you, ask the duck.